You've been lied to your entire life. They told you that communication is the key to success, that explaining yourself makes you credible, that justification builds trust. But here's the truth they don't want you to know. Every time you explain yourself, you're admitting weakness. Every justification is a confession of insecurity. Every defense you mount is proof that you're already losing. The moment you stop explaining yourself is the moment you gain real power, and most people will never understand this because they're too busy begging for validation from those who don't deserve their attention. Think about this. Right now, as you're watching this, you're probably defending decisions you made yesterday to people who will forget about them tomorrow. You're crafting careful explanations for why you chose what you chose, why what you said, why you are who you are. And with every word of explanation, you're hemorrhaging power. You're teaching people that you need their approval. You're training them to question you. You're establishing yourself as someone who answers to their judgment. This is the death spiral of weak people, and you've been caught in it without even realizing it. The cost of this behavior isn't just annoying, it's catastrophic. Every explanation you give is a negotiation where you've already lost. When you explain yourself, you're implicitly accepting someone else's right to judge you. You're positioning yourself below them in the hierarchy. You're saying, "My actions require your approval to be valid." And once you've said that, you've given them power over you that you can never fully take back. They know you'll bend. They know you'll justify. They know you'll accommodate their doubts. You've become predictable, and predictable people get exploited. Look at your life right now. How many times this week have you explained a choice to someone who had no real authority over you? How many times have you justified your feelings, your schedule, your priorities to people who contribute nothing to your success? How many conversations have you had where you found yourself defending your existence to someone who doesn't fund your life, doesn't share your struggles, and won't remember the conversation in a month? This is the tax the weak pay to the unworthy, and you've been paying it in installments your entire life. The people who run the world don't explain themselves. CEOs don't justify their decisions to middle managers. Presidents don't defend their worldview to critics on social media. Alphas don't explain their dating choices to their ex-partners. Why? Because explanation is the language of subordination. When you explain, you're asking permission retroactively. You're seeking approval after the fact. You're positioning yourself as someone who needs consensus to act. And consensus is the enemy of excellence. Consensus is where bold decisions go to die, smothered by the mediocrity of people who have never risked anything. Here's what happens when you stop explaining yourself. First, people respect you more. This sounds counterintuitive to people who've spent their lives over-communicating, but it's absolutely true. Respect isn't built on transparency. It's built on boundaries. When you refuse to explain, you create mystery. Mystery generates respect because it signals value. Things that require no explanation are either worthless or so obviously valuable that defense is unnecessary. When you stop explaining, you force people to decide which category you fall into, and most will unconsciously choose the latter. They'll respect you because your refusal to explain signals that you don't need their validation to know you're right. Second, you stop attracting questioning. This is critical. The more you explain, the more questions you invite. Every answer you give spawns 3 more questions because you've established yourself as someone who responds to interrogation. You've trained people to probe you. But when you stop explaining, the questions dry up. People learn that asking you why leads nowhere. They adapt, they accept, they move on. You become a closed system that doesn't leak energy through justification. This is how powerful people conserve their mental resources, while weak people exhaust themselves defending every decision to every casual observer. Third, you filter out the wrong people automatically. People who need constant explanation are people who don't trust your judgment. They're people who believe they have a right to audit your choices. These are not your people. These are energy vampires who will demand justification for everything you do because their own lives lack direction and they need to control yours to feel significant. When you stop explaining yourself, these people become uncomfortable and leave. This is not a loss. This is a purge. You're removing from your life everyone who thinks your choices require their approval, and what remains are people who respect your autonomy. This is addition by subtraction. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, where most people who hear this message will fall away. Stopping explanation requires you to be okay with being misunderstood. This is the price of power that nobody wants to pay. You've been conditioned your entire life to fear misunderstanding. You've been taught that being misunderstood is failure, that clarity is king, that you must make everyone comprehend your intentions or you've somehow failed at communication. This is a trap. Powerful people understand that being misunderstood by the masses is not a bug, it's a feature. Nietzsche said it. The lonely one offers his hand too quickly to whomever he encounters. When you need everyone to understand you, you're the lonely one. Desperately grasping for connection with people who aren't qualified to judge your path. Let's go deeper into what happens psychologically when you explain yourself. You're activating what psychologists call the justification cascade. Every time you justify a decision, you're actually undermining your own conviction about that decision. The act of explaining suggests the decision is questionable. If it weren't questionable, why would it need explanation? This is why trial lawyers tell defendants to never take the stand unless absolutely necessary. Guilty or innocent, the moment you start explaining yourself, you plant seeds of doubt. Your explanations, no matter how logical, create the impression that your choices were uncertain enough to require defense. Moreover, explanation shifts the frame from outcome to intention. When you explain why you did something, you're asking people to judge your reasoning process instead of your results. This is catastrophic because reasoning is subjective and attackable, while results are objective and final. Machiavelli understood this perfectly. He wrote that a prince should be judged by his effectiveness, not his methods. The moment you explain your methods, you invite judgment on the one dimension where you're most vulnerable. Your results speak for themselves. Your reasoning will always be debatable. By explaining, you're choosing to be judged on the weaker metric. Consider the dark psychology at play when someone demands an explanation from you. What are they really asking for? They're asking for leverage. They're asking you to expose your decision-making process so they can find weaknesses in it. They're asking you to give them ammunition to use against you later. Every explanation is reconnaissance that your enemies conduct on your thinking. When you freely offer explanations, you're handing over intelligence about how you think, what you value, what you fear, and where you might compromise. This is why interrogators ask people to explain themselves. Explanation is confession, disguised as communication. Now, let me address the objection forming in your mind right now. You're thinking, but I'm not a dictator. I live in a world with partners, colleagues, family, friends. Don't I owe them explanations? This is the domestication talking. This is the slave morality that's been programmed into you. You owe people outcomes, not explanations. You owe your employer results, not a narrative about why you chose this approach over that one. You owe your partner loyalty and effort, not a dissertation on your thought process. You owe your friends presence and support, not a defense of how you spend your time when you're not with them. The people who love you and value you will trust your judgment without explanation. The people who demand constant justification are the people who don't respect you enough to assume competence. There's a crucial distinction here between explanation and communication. Communication is essential. You absolutely must communicate expectations, boundaries, and information. But communication is forward-looking. It tells people what is or what will be. Explanation is backward-looking. It justifies what was. Communication is strategic. Explanation is defensive. When your boss asks what you're working on, you communicate your current projects. When your boss asks why you chose this approach, they're inviting you to explain, and that's where you maintain frame. This approach will deliver the outcome you need by the deadline you set is communication. Well, I chose this because I thought about this other option, but then I realized that might not work because is explanation. And you've just revealed uncertainty, considered alternatives, and invited them to second-guess you. Let me give you a real-world example of this principle in action. Steve Jobs was famous for refusing to explain Apple's decisions. When the iPhone launched without a keyboard, the tech press demanded explanation. Physical keyboards were standard. Every smartphone had one. Surely, Apple owed the market an explanation for this radical departure. Jobs gave none. He didn't defend the choice. He didn't justify the touchscreen-only design. He simply released it and let the results speak. That refusal to explain wasn't arrogance. It was strategic brilliance. Any explanation would have invited debate about the merits of the decision before people could experience the product. By refusing to explain, Jobs forced the market to judge the iPhone on its actual performance, not on the theoretical soundness of the design philosophy. The product became its own justification. Contrast that with companies that over-explain. When a product fails, they release statements explaining what went wrong, what they were thinking, what they'll do differently. This seems transparent and accountable, but what's it actually doing? It's giving competitors a roadmap of their vulnerabilities. It's giving customers reasons to doubt them. It's establishing a pattern where the company answers to public pressure. These companies train their stakeholders to demand explanations, and then they wonder why they can't make bold moves without facing intense scrutiny. They've explained away their power. Here's the dark truth about human nature that makes non-explanation so powerful. People instinctively submit to certainty. When you explain yourself, you're expressing uncertainty. You're saying, "I'm not sure you'll agree with this, so let me convince you." But when you simply state or act without explanation, you're expressing certainty. You're saying, "This is reality, adapt to it." And most people, when confronted with someone else's certainty, will adapt rather than challenge. It's a dominance mechanism wired into social primates. The individual who acts without seeking permission becomes the de facto leader, and the group accepts this because challenge requires more energy than compliance. This is why cult leaders, authoritarians, and charismatic manipulators never explain themselves. They understand that explanation breaks the spell of their authority. The moment they justify their commands, they're admitting those commands could be otherwise. They're opening the door to negotiation. They're suggesting their authority is conditional rather than absolute. Now, I'm not advocating you become a manipulative authoritarian, but you need to understand the psychological mechanisms at play so you can use them ethically in your own life. Your refusal to explain isn't manipulation when it's protecting your legitimate autonomy. It's manipulation when you're using it to control others unethically. Know the difference. But stopping explanation is only half the battle. The real power move is replacing explanation with outcome demonstration. When someone questions your choice, you don't owe them a breakdown of your reasoning. You owe them proof that your choice works. This shifts the entire dynamic. Instead of defending your process, you're pointing to your results. "Why did you turn down that job offer?" becomes, "The path I'm on is producing these outcomes." "Why did you end that relationship?" becomes, "I'm healthier and more focused now." "Why did you start that business?" becomes, "Here's the revenue after 6 months." See the difference? You're not arguing about whether your reasoning was sound. You're presenting evidence that your decision was effective. This is the ruthless pragmatism that separates winners from philosophers. Philosophers explain. Winners demonstrate. And here's the brutal part. When you demonstrate outcomes instead of explaining reasoning, you make it impossible for people to argue with you. They can debate your logic. They can poke holes in your justifications. They can find inconsistencies in your explanation, but they cannot argue with results. Results are the ultimate authority. When you lead with outcomes, you're playing on the only field where your victory is indisputable. Now, we're reaching the critical insight that will separate those who merely understand this concept from those who will actually implement it. The reason you explain yourself isn't actually about helping others understand. It's about managing your own anxiety. Every time you explain, you're soothing your fear of judgment. You're trying to preemptively control how others perceive you. You're attempting to avoid criticism by getting ahead of it with justification. This is anxiety masquerading as communication. And the only way to stop explaining is to become comfortable with being criticized, misunderstood, and judged. This is the leap most people cannot make. They would rather exhaust themselves with endless explanation than sit with the discomfort of letting others think whatever they want. But here's what you need to understand. They're going to think whatever they want anyway. Your explanations don't control their perceptions. Your explanations just give them more material to work with when they form their judgments. A person predisposed to criticize you will find fault in your explanation. A person predisposed to support you doesn't need an explanation. Everyone else doesn't care enough to listen to your justification in the first place. So, who exactly are you explaining yourself to? You're explaining to your own anxiety, and anxiety is a terrible audience that demands infinite content and is never satisfied. When you truly internalize this, when you realize that explanation serves your anxiety rather than your relationships, something shifts. You stop seeing non-explanation as withholding and start seeing it as self-respect. You stop seeing other people's questions as obligations and start seeing them as tests. And most importantly, you stop seeing silence as emptiness and start seeing it as power. The void you leave when you don't explain is space where others project their own narratives, and those narratives often favor you more than your actual explanations would have. Here's a tactical implementation guide because philosophy without application is just mental masturbation. When someone asks you to explain a decision, you have several options that aren't explanation. First, acknowledge and redirect. I appreciate your curiosity, but I'm confident in this direction. Second, outcome preview. Give it 6 months and the results will make sense. Third, boundary statement. That's personal to me. Fourth, simple deflection. It felt right. Fifth, and most powerful, saying nothing at all. A slight smile and a subject change. The refusal to even acknowledge that an explanation is expected. This is apex power, the ability to simply move on as if the question was never asked. Each of these responses does something your explanations never did. They preserve your power while maintaining the relationship. They don't burn bridges. They don't create enemies. They simply establish that you're not someone who negotiates your choices after the fact, and people adapt to this faster than you think. The first time you refuse to explain, there might be pushback. The second time, less. By the third time, people learn. You've trained them that asking you why is unproductive, and they stop asking. This isn't coldness. This is boundary setting. This is teaching people how to interact with you in a way that respects your autonomy. But let's address the scenario you're worried about. What about when you're actually wrong? What about when your decision was bad and someone has legitimate grounds to question it? Here's the dark truth. Explaining yourself when you're wrong is even more damaging than explaining yourself when you're right. When you're wrong and you explain, you're cataloging your failures in detail. You're giving everyone a comprehensive guide to your incompetence. You're creating a permanent record of bad judgment. But when you're wrong and you don't explain, you maintain the option to simply pivot. That didn't work. Moving to this instead is infinitely more powerful than that didn't work. Because I thought this and calculated that and assumed this other thing, all of which turned out to be incorrect. The people who demand explanations when you fail are not trying to help you. They're trying to establish a pattern where you're accountable to them. They want to create a precedent where your failures require their approval to move past. Don't give them this. Acknowledge the failure, present the new direction, and move forward. Your failures don't require explanation any more than your successes do. They require correction and learning, which you can do privately without giving everyone else a seminar on your thought process. This brings us to the peak realization. the insight that transforms everything you thought you knew about power and communication. The moment you stop explaining yourself, you're not just changing your communication style. You're fundamentally restructuring your relationship with authority itself, because here's what explanation really is. It's an appeal to external authority. When you explain, you're asking someone else to validate your choice based on the reasoning you provide. You're submitting your decision to their judgment. You're saying their approval matters more than your own conviction. But when you stop explaining, you become your own ultimate authority. You're saying, my judgment is sufficient. My conviction is enough. My understanding of my own life and circumstances exceeds your understanding, and therefore your approval is unnecessary. This is the psychological shift from external locus of control to internal locus of control. This is the moment you stop being a passenger in your own life and become the driver. This is when you stop seeking permission from the world and start granting permission to yourself. And here's the terrifying beauty of this transformation. Once you become your own authority, once you stop explaining yourself to others, you also stop explaining yourself to yourself. You stop the internal monologue of justification. You stop relitigating every decision in your head. You stop second-guessing every choice you make because you're no longer in the habit of defending your choices to an imaginary tribunal. You decide, you act, you adjust based on outcomes, and you move forward. This is the efficiency of the powerful. This is why successful people seem to operate at a different speed than everyone else. They're not smarter, they're not luckier. They've just eliminated the tax of constant self-justification that slows everyone else down. Think about how much mental energy you spend explaining yourself to yourself, replaying conversations where you justified your choice, rehearsing future conversations where you might need to defend your position, constructing elaborate logical frameworks for why you did what you did, not for anyone else's benefit, but for your own peace of mind. This is the hidden cost of explanation culture. It doesn't just drain your energy in external conversations. It creates an internal habit of doubt that poisons your decision-making at the source. When you break this habit, when you become someone who doesn't explain externally or internally, your decisiveness transforms. You can see an opportunity and take it without spending 3 days building a case for why it's the right move. You can end a relationship that's not working without constructing an airtight justification for why it's okay to prioritize your happiness. You can start a business, move to a new city, change careers, cut off toxic people, all without the paralysis of needing your choices to be defensible to some imaginary jury. This is freedom. This is power. This is what it feels like to be unencumbered by the need for external or internal validation. So here's what I'm telling you to do, and this is the part where you either change or you go back to the life you've always lived. Stop explaining yourself. Starting today, starting with the next person who asks you to justify a choice you've made. Feel the discomfort of not filling the silence with justification. Feel the anxiety of letting someone wonder about your reasoning. Feel the fear that they might judge you, misunderstand you, or think less of you. And sit with those feelings instead of soothing them with explanation. Because on the other side of that discomfort is a version of you that's more powerful than you've ever been. This isn't easy. You've spent your entire life explaining yourself. You've been rewarded for it in school, where showing your work mattered as much as getting the right answer. You've been trained in it by managers who demanded justification for every decision. You've been conditioned by relationships where explanation was confused with intimacy. Breaking this pattern will feel wrong at first. It will feel cold, arrogant, or withholding. Let it feel that way. Those feelings are the death throes of the weak version of you that needed everyone's approval to exist. The strong version of you, the powerful version, the version that achieves what it sets out to achieve, that version doesn't explain. It decides, acts, demonstrates, and moves forward. That version respects other people enough to let them think what they think without trying to control their perceptions through explanation. That version respects itself enough to trust its own judgment without requiring external validation. That version is on the other side of this choice to stop explaining yourself. And if you found value in this message, if something in you recognized the truth of what I'm saying, subscribe to this channel because we're just getting started on dismantling the lies you've been told about success, power, and influence. But more importantly, go into your life today and refuse to explain yourself to someone who expects it. Start small if you need to, build the muscle. Because the moment you stop explaining yourself is the moment you start living like someone who doesn't need permission to be who you are. And that person, the one who doesn't explain, who doesn't justify, who doesn't defend every choice to every casual observer, that person has a power you've only dreamed about until now.